Well, we'll get started. Thank you so much, everyone, for plugging in. I know many people are joining in, but in fairness of the time, we'll kick off the call. So thank you all for joining today. My name is Unmesh Sheth, founder of SOPAC, and I really welcome you all from wherever you are globally, whether you are in Africa or India or European continent or US. Welcome to you all. This is a very exciting webinar today. So I hope you are also as excited as well, but it's just uh, in my opinion, it's one of the very important and one of the most important topic in impact management part of process altogether. As many of you know, impact revaluation has started. And as part of the journey, everyone from the business to impact investors to philanthropy, they're struggling to understand what the social impact is, how to really make sure that their portfolio of companies are growing and maximizing social impact, social and environmental impact. And that process essentially can only start by having more well-intentioned process altogether. And so to explain that process, we have invited Claudia Coppenolle, and she's the co-founder of the and CEO of the IMP+ACT Alliance. Many of you already know that she really leads not only IMP+ACT Alliance, but he has a very deep root into the impact management projects. Essentially, more than 2,000 practitioners and supporters really have coalesced behind it. Many of you who are familiar with the impact management project, this is a very groundbreaking projects that I have not seen that in this sector at all, which is really about, for the first time, there is an opportunity to define impact evidence of the investments. And as you know, many of the investors to impact practitioners, that identifying what the impact is and how do you come up with a plan to maximize the impact requires some kind of guideline, and impact management project is a very foundational project. And from that, obviously, Claudia started IMP+ACT Alliance, which is really a very groundbreaking technology initiative and awareness campaign for public good. And together, over 150 organizations based on logic and norms of the impact management project, they have developed impact classification systems. And that's a digital process that enables asset managers to describe how they report and categorize social and environmental impact. Now, as you will see, and as I talk about the journey, this is a two-part presentation. In the first part, essentially, you will see talk about impact classification, and Claudia will do complete walkthrough on the process, which is most asset managers should be familiar with it. And it's a very important process because whenever you want to maximize the impact, you have to have a well-defined classification or baseline. Without that, you can't even maximize the impact. So that's period. And you have to have a good mechanisms, and IMP+ACT Alliance is a very groundbreaking project that helps you understand where your portfolio is and how can you move it. Okay. So the second part of this discussion is, once you understand the classification, how do you move the needle? How do you maximize the impact, essentially? And for example, a lot of the funds and asset managers may still be in an A category or some of them in a B, but real goal is to go into the bottommost quadrant of the C. What does that mean? How do I really move that? And that's where there are a lot of challenges happening. So this is really a very important subject where you, if you are coming from asset manager or impact practitioner's background, this is going to be very insightful presentation for you. Just for you to know who we are, so this is a webinar series. It's a live conversations for impact management practitioners. It's a very, very popular series, and thank you for again joining to this series. In this webinar, in past, we have had leaders coming from different backgrounds, from industry to practitioners like Jamie Nichols and well-known impact practitioners like Jane Reisman and Veronica and 60 Decibels, Lindsay Smalling. So it's a very conversational series, and I'm so happy that Claudia has graciously accepted to be with us essentially today. And so looking forward to hearing from Claudia. Before I invite Claudia, I also would like to introduce you who SOPACT is. So SOPACT is really committed to working with any impact intentional organizations to maximize the impact based on stakeholder-based approach. As you know, one of the foundation principle of impact management project is impact is really all about stakeholders. And all the 5 dimensions to the impact that we talk about today really is all about stakeholders. So if stakeholders are not engaged or not part of the process, essentially, you are not communicating the right evidence altogether. And that is fundamental to us in helping and growing this space. So with that, before I invite, I would like to share one of the quote from one of our previous speaker, Jeremy Nichols. You may know him. He was also co-founder of Social Value International. And I just want to leave you with this quote, which is impact reporting without being audited is just marketing. So there is a lot being talked about in this topic, essentially. Many of the asset manager needs to start paying attention about impact washing. And really the purpose of impact management is about growing and scaling and making a decision about how you can work for the stakeholders altogether. Again, I'm not going to take up a lot of my time. I'm going to invite Claudia now. Before I do that, I'm going to give you a bit more of a quick walkthrough on the Zoom. Most of you are familiar by now. Please feel free to chat and introduce yourself and share your information or ask. Just share it and collaborate on a chat window, but do not ask questions in chat window. Ask the questions in Q&A sections. And the second part, once Claudia describes about next topic, which is impact verification, she will take on some of your questions. And again, let's enjoy. And Claudia, thank you so much for joining us. It's really a privilege for you that you are joining us and talking to our impact practitioners community. And this is a great conversation. Looking forward to you. So please take it on.
Thanks, Unmesh, and thanks for having me. It's very generous of you. So warm welcome, everyone, also from my side. So as Unmesh kindly introduced me, my name is Claudia. I'm the CEO and co-founder of the IMP+ACT Alliance. And while I saw a few familiar names when I scanned the registration list, maybe for the ones less familiar with the IMP+ACT Alliance and the work we do. So the IMP+ACT Alliance is a field building program, which was initially seed funded and sponsored by Deutsche Bank, the City of London, the United Nations Development Programme, and Bridges Insights. And our focus of work is really to share and create best practice examples together with practitioners. So together with a working group of over 30 asset managers, some of them leading in the space of impact investing and impact measurement and management, we have created resources, tools, and education material that we openly and transparently share with the rest of the ecosystem. And importantly, together with this group, we also developed, as Unmesh pointed out, a technology platform that is called the Impact Classification System. And the Impact Classification System is free and publicly accessible to anyone, so asset managers, but equally academia, asset owners, enterprises, who want to start to self-assess and report of the impact of their investments. So for us, it was important to create a central repository that could be used by anyone who's interested in describing how and to what degree they're currently thinking of measuring, managing, and reporting the impact of their investments. The reason we thought that was important was feedback we actually received from the practitioner community, because the asset managers we talk to and we work with all said the same thing. The struggle on their side really is, and I couldn't put it better than one of our working group members, Lynn Tomlinson, who's the head of impact at Claudia Coppenolle, which is part of the Schroders Group. And she said, it really feels like swimming in an alphabet soup of terminologies and standards and metrics and disclosures, and now throw all the new regulation in there. So from a practitioner and investment and asset manager point of view, it's really, really hard to distinguish which metrics and disclosures to apply and what is relevant and what isn't. And then you flip the coin and you look at this from the investors and asset owners' point of view, and they are actually faced with a very similar challenge, being that from the asset managers, they receive so various different impact reports and so much different methodology that is applied, that for somebody who has to manage a multi-asset, multi-manager portfolio, it is incredibly difficult to get how the underlying investments in a portfolio actually align with impact intentions and meet certain impact goals. And this is really the starting point. So I thought for today, where I start you off with is to describe for the ones a little bit less familiar with this impact measurement and management ecosystem, what it is that we're talking about when we talk about various different terminology, principles, standards, metrics, and disclosure sets, and how they all fit together. So on the left-hand side, it is something that we refer to as market agreed principles. So they are actually guidelines that holistically have been agreed to or aligned with by multiple players in the field and agreed to as something that commonly should be applied when you set up your best practice investment practice, if you like. So I think commonly known are obviously the principles that were put out by PRI and other UN organizations, which you see here on the slide, but commonly known on financial products level, you also have something like the operating principles for impact management by the IFC or facilitated through the IFC. So that is something that explains the processes and procedures and something you could adhere to if you really want to follow best practices. In the middle of the slide, we're moving away from practice to actually performance. And then ultimately, this is the data points and the key performance indicators you can collect from the underlying assets or the underlying holdings in your portfolio to actually prove and evidence that an impact has occurred. So if you think about climate, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 kind of indicators could fall into that category. And again, it's a broad range of players in this field. Again, coming back to the acronyms that Lynn pointed out in her quote. So you have CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project. You have IRIS+, which is obviously the metric sets that is commonly applied by many and was invented or produced, developed by the Global Impact Investing Network, the GIN. Importantly and increasingly, we're also seeing regulation playing into this category. So take, for example, SFDR, so the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation in Europe. They are adding now a list of agreed metrics and disclosure sets into that mix, which they call the PAIs, the Principal Adverse Impact Indicators, that at least to a certain degree will in Europe create some consistency and transparency on a set of 42 indicators or 32 that are mandatory, and then an additional 18 that people can collect data against, and then actually investors can consistently use to understand better how certain investment meets certain credentials. And then on top of that, and very helpfully, there are obviously leading players in the field who have taken a lot of resources and time into their hand to support efforts from investment practitioners to guide them and how they can set up their impact measurement and management activities and processes. You have the Global Impact Investing Network there, you have the OECD there, you have something like UNDP in there with the SDG Impact Program. They obviously just released the SDG Impact Standards. And all of that together creates a well-manned, but at the same time, very fragmented ecosystem for impact measurement and management. And ultimately, what we have seen in the work we do on a day-to-day basis with investment practitioners is that this has left asset managers in a situation that with too much to choose from, they have started to create their own frameworks and their own approaches. And that ultimately, from a data point of view, has created an absolute nightmare for investors or portfolio managers that actually require consistent data and consistent information from all of their underlying managers on certain KPIs that they want to measure. And we've seen in the data space, there are obviously an increasing amount of data providers and solution providers that are coming into that space. But ultimately, they are faced with the same challenge that for their ratings and for their scores, they can choose from a broad range of metrics and disclosure sets. And ultimately, that leaves the market in a situation where data isn't necessarily comparable, and that creates inconsistency. And then ultimately, that creates also a lack of reliability of the data that people use to actually assess if their investments are aligning with the goals they personally are having with the capital that they are allocating to investments. So data seems to be a big challenge for ESG and impact investing. And ultimately, I think what we are all concerned about is that it's holding back capital, that it's needed to actually advance and progress some of the sustainable development goals that we are all trying, I think, jointly to achieve. And ultimately, it's a struggle that both sides of the stories have. So the asset managers and enterprises are faced with increasing reporting burden, which is obviously resource and cost heavy, whereas investors are struggling because they don't get the data and the quality of analysis that they need to manage their portfolios to further advance sustainable development goals. So where does that leave us, and how can we practically solve for this? And I think what's really, really important to bear in mind, and maybe on a more upbeat note, we've seen a lot of really good developments in this space. And let me start with the long-term picture. So I think what has happened over the last couple of months is that we have seen more and more news coming out of progress in streamlining and harmonizing this space. So last September, 5 of the largest standards setting organizations, including, for example, JIRA and SASB, have actually pledged to work together on a common corporate ESG reporting system. So that was a big, big move in the market, and it's something that we all, I think, are looking forward to. And that was just a signal for things to come. So as I previously mentioned, we've seen increasing regulation in this space. In Europe, obviously driven and kind of triggered by the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. But we equally see in the US, obviously, a lot of new desire from the SEC, especially in the climate space, to start monitoring how asset managers are actually managing ESG credentials of their investments. And then ultimately, I think what everybody gets excited about in the run-up to the UN's COP26 in November here, actually in the UK, is the work of the IFS Foundation, who have actually said that they might launch a sustainable standards board. And that would be obviously a huge signal into the market for further harmonization, aggregation, and standardization. So long term, I think everybody has acknowledged and is working on a solution to further streamline, standardize, and aggregate information and data in this field. But what we're talking about today is like, where does it leave you? If you are an investor and an asset owner and you really, really want to advance sustainable development and align portfolio with your impact goals and your intentions, and you want to ensure that the investments in your portfolio are actually doing what they say on the box, what can you do? So on the basis of that, we looked and worked with practitioners to understand how we can support actually activities that would allow to round existing measurement approaches and rating techniques in the same logic, so thereby not adding to the reporting burden of asset managers, but helping to aggregate and streamline and then ultimately translate it into a language that can be commonly applied by everybody. And when we did our market research, we came across the work, obviously, of the Impact Management Project, as Unmish had pointed out at the beginning of this webinar. And what the Impact Management Project had achieved already a few years ago with a network of over 2,000 practitioners is to come up with commonly accepted logic and norms that allow to at least categorize and classify investments with similar impact characteristics. And that sounds very familiar to those that come from kind of the finance sector, because impact classes ultimately work very similar like financial asset classes. as such that they group and categorize those investments that are advancing certain sustainable development goals in the same degree. And I will talk a little bit more about that categorization, which we refer to as the ABC categorization. What impact classes do as well, they actually assess to what degree and how investors are supporting that impact of the underlying assets in a portfolio. So they're actually assessing the strategies that asset managers are applying to advance sustainable development or ESG credentials. And bringing those two elements together, so looking at the impact of the underlying assets as well as the investor contribution, creates this dashboard view or this matrix, and you can see it here on the left-hand side of the slide, which then allows a portfolio manager or an asset owners to actually map their investments into these categories. And ultimately, because the impact classes are, unlike other ratings and scores, very actionable because they describe actually what that specific investment does with regards to an impact goal, it allows you then to understand where a portfolio stands and how you can actually create a path or a journey to meet your individual impact goals. Importantly, and I think that is the thing that I always get asked, so I thought I weave it into the presentation today, this is not a finger in the air assessment. Obviously, classification and categorization is as any other measurement and management technique based on data. And we use, or we look at the 5 dimensions of impact, again, a logic that has been developed by the Impact Management Project that categorizes impact data categories in 5 areas: the what, the who, the how much, the contribution, and the risk. And then it actually asks asset managers to collect data against those data points. And again, so ultimately, and we will see this in the conversation later, or we talk about this a little bit more, the ultimate goal obviously is that we have this granular data that can be audited and verified. But what we wanted to achieve is to give people a clear process to understand where they are, also to identify where there are probably data gaps, but still allow them to categorize them and categorize the behavior of an investment according to these ABC categorizations. So what is it that I'm talking about when I talk about ABC categorization? So ultimately, what the Impact Management Project has done is they looked at a threshold as to what good enough looks like, and then looked at how investments and to what degree certain underlying assets, or so it's applicable for enterprises as it is for investments, are actually supporting impact goals. And the first category, and that is one that has not a name, but we occasionally refer to it as the Z category, is there are obviously investments that may and does cause harm, and they don't necessarily manage ESG credentials to date. So that is what you see on the left-hand side on the slide. But then the main categories are what we call A, B, and C, and they allow us to label and to describe how a product actually aligns with your impact goals. So the A category, acting to avoid harm, means it is an investment, an asset, or a holding that actually mitigates negative outcomes. That means they have data that allows them to compare impact KPIs from one time stamp to another, and then assess that there was a reduction in the negative outcomes. So we still, if you think about the threshold as to what good enough looks like, we're still moving in the negative scale, but we can at least say that an asset manager or a fund has put practices or other procedures into place to mitigate that negative outcome. The B category means benefit stakeholders, and here we are moving above the threshold. So we're creating positive outcomes. So we actually are now in a positive area, if you like. And then the C categorization, which obviously we feel all very strongly about and which is often referred to as impact, is what we call contributing to solutions. And this category is very special as such as A, you would have more data points, would need to have more data points to hand to actually evidence and prove that an impact has occurred. And So contributing to solutions not only looks at a positive outcome, but it also looks at the who. So is that outcome either significant or serves an otherwise underserved stakeholder? So it's looking at depth as well as intentionality. So these are the three categories. And for those in Europe, but I'm guessing all over the world, because hopefully, finger crossed, with the audience today, everybody is checking the news for any developments in this space. This is an approach of aggregating and labeling investments that is very well aligned with the EU Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. So this regulation has, as we have identified, that obviously with a view on greenwashing, asset managers have had a free range into how they label and describe their products. So you will be all well familiar with that. So you see ESG funds and sustainable funds and impact funds. But ultimately, there was very regulation as to, and coming back to Jeremy's quote, how you could market impact. So what the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation does, it gives guidances, at the moment is purely in a wording format, as to how you can label and describe your investment products, but ultimately you will actually need to prove against these principal adverse impact indicators, which I had mentioned before, how a product delivers against these. And these categories are very well aligned with the thinking of the Impact Management Project, as well as that the Article 6 kind of categorization aligns with what we call the article, the class Z, so may or does cause harm category. Then you have the Article 8, which in our language, or in the language of the IMP, would be the act to avoid harm, so A category. And then you have a big bucket, which is the Article 9, so sustainable investments, which in our language would actually include the B and the C category. There is obviously a risk, and something that we have been working on with our practitioners, that we lose the nuance between actually a positive outcome and an impact. And that is something we can talk a little bit more about when we talk about verification and the relevance of further distinguishment and data in this space. So now I've given you a little bit of a really baseline understanding as to what impact classes are and why we think impact classification is timely, because it aligns well with regulation, but it's something that practitioners can actually use today while we wait for standardization in this space. I want to show you how it works in action. And I thought I'd give you an example of something that I actually have done. So I work with a lot of practitioners, but I also often support next-gen investors in their efforts to better understand how certain investments in their portfolio actually meet their impact intentions. So as an exercise, we actually looked online what type of information we could find about certain funds in a portfolio. And on the slide, you can see that the impact reports that, let me add, finally we managed to get, and some of the information we finally managed to find somewhere in the World Wide Web, are not really comparable, and they not really tell you anything. And what I mean when I say they don't really tell you anything is, if you look at the existing ratings and scores out there and the data offerings, if you like, then there are obviously certain ratings and scores that apply on fund level and certain that apply on organizational level. And I think it's already difficult to understand which actually are practice orientated and which are actually performance orientated. So that's the first kind of challenge. If you're not really intimately familiar with the underlying methodology of a rating or a score, how can you even tell what it is and what it means for your portfolio, and how it meets your appetite for impact, if you like. So ultimately, what we're saying is, isn't there a way that we can actually continue to use the great data and knowledge and understanding of these data solutions, as well as the efforts that asset managers are doing proprietarily, but ground them in the same logic? And you can see here, one of the things that will potentially help with comparability is SFDR, but only just to a certain degree. And then what we, however, want to achieve is to get a means and to find a way that we actually create further consistency, and how all of this information can get funneled and streamlined, aggregated but then ultimately allows an investor to say like, okay, an AAA actually translate or is equivalent to a 3 globe or is equivalent to a score of 92. And that brings me to a process, again, that we have developed together with asset managers who have been incredibly helpful and generous in supporting our efforts over the last 2 years. And we came up with the impact classification system. So it is an online process that guides anyone who wants to use it through a 7-step kind of online, I don't want to call it a survey because that screams 150 questions, which this one isn't. So it's a very short kind of guided process that allows you to explain how you're engaging currently with best practices. And we have also sourced and fed into the tool all the various different things that we are aware of exist in the world. And again, practitioners have been immensely helpful for us to actually distinguish those that they feel are relevant and those that they feel less relevant for certain sectors and areas. Then we assess and ask questions about the investor contribution and the strategy, management approach, governance, and transparency that asset managers apply to actually set up their processes and procedures. And we worked with UNDP's SDG impact program to actually include on a high level the SDG impact standards into the system. So kind of further aligning the description and language we all using in the ecosystem to talk about best practices. Then we ask and assess what data types asset managers are actually using to evidence the impact in their portfolios. And again, we're not judgmental. We don't make a value judgment. We don't tell you use this metrics or this disclosure type. We just allow you to tell us what are the data types you have available to date, which data providers are you using. And then on the basis of that kind of initial assessment, we allow you to translate that and classify your investments according to the impact classes and the impact classification that was developed through the impact management project. Then what you get out of this is an impact report, if you like, or as we call it, a classification statement, which you can see here on the right-hand side of the slide. And ultimately, we're creating a database that can be used by investors and asset owners to better understand how their portfolio are performing. And as we are aligning with the impact classes, as well as with the SDGs, we really are intending and hoping to create commonality in the way that we can look at portfolios. And it's actionable, because coming back to some of the scores, like if you don't know on which basis somebody came up with a 92% score, that doesn't really tell you anything. Whereas if somebody tells you that 90% of your portfolio is currently still doing or may cause harm and only 10% is acting to avoid harm, that gives you very good guidance with regards to the actions you might be able to take with some of the investments in your portfolio to move them out of one category into another. And so to give you some kind of more granular insights in how this reporting looks like. So I've chosen some publicly listed funds and their classification, as well as their alignment with the SDGs. So on a snapshot, you immediately can see how they are comparing, which ones might actually meet your thematic kind of focus, as well as your impact appetite. And then we also obviously want to support you further with a screening process, meaning that very cumbersome going on the website, asking your wealth advisor for an impact report, screening 35 pages. We take that away by providing you actually with a very brief, almost LinkedIn-like screen grab of what asset managers have said with regards to their practices. So how are they engaging with best practices out there? And then ultimately also what data points would they have available in case you wanted to do a full due diligence on them. And I wanted to finish on an actual example that we have recently done with Claudia Coppenolle, who is a fund of fund. So they actually asked 21 of their fund managers to use the impact classification process or the impact classification system as part of their onboarding and screening, and then to map their portfolio actively. You can see here, and what it actually translates into is that 23% of the fund acts to avoid harm, an additional 46%, excuse me, benefit stakeholder, and then they have approximately over 31% that contributes to solution. And they were able to do this assessment and communicate that very clearly now to their investors, because they mapped every individual fund into the impact classes. So they did a mapping to understand where and how the fund managers would actually land on this dashboard or on this metrics view, and how they themselves are advancing impact and sustainable development goals. And then furthermore, and that leads me very neatly into the conversation with Unmish about verification, they very quickly saw that a self-assessment and reporting, even if it's guided, and even if there is additional education, and even if people are disclosing what type of data and metrics that they're applying, leaves room for interpretation. And hence, they actually did a calibration exercise where they furthermore ask all the various different asset managers to also provide an assessment of the underlying assets in their portfolios. And then the sustainable finance team at Coppenolle Capital looked at all of these various different classifications and did a calibration exercise in order to start the audit and the verification that we all feel is so well needed to further ensure that the quality of the data and the quality of the impact reporting actually meets the standards as we would expect from a financial performance audit. And I think that leaves me to open the floor to question. And Unmish, I'm sure I saw, at least in the chat, trickling in a lot of questions. So I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Claudia. This is very important and very groundbreaking work for many people who are looking to understand and how to classify the impact. And this is an amazing primer. I'm so glad that you shared this. So Claudia, to set the ground for the second part of the conversation, the classification is the one part of the big puzzle, essentially. And what we have seen, obviously, from our perspective, is that we see that asset managers and enterprises, they both are still struggling to understand where they are, and this classification really helps them. But then there's also further misunderstandings of what even if you do it, where do you go next, essentially. And so we at SOPACT, essentially, if you can allow me to share the screen. So we have, and I'm going to just be very brief, obviously, to make my point here, but fundamentally, really how we see is that a lot of the asset managers and enterprises are struggling to understand the maturity of their portfolio companies altogether. So even if they understand where they stand, they need to understand how to move the needle. And unless they understand whether they are early stage to the maturity, it's difficult to move the needle, essentially. They also need ways to improve and maximize the social impact of the portfolio company. So how do they mature them? Because even the reason why you're investing in first place is to make sure that not just the financial return, but there's also significant amount of social return on investment into the company as well. And unless there's a very concentrated approach on building the maturity, you are not going to be able to move the needle. And finally, how does the impact manager ensure the program investments has the most potential to scale the impact? And unless there's a step-by-step process, essentially, if you look at from the funder's perspective, whether they're asset manager, accelerators, program organizations, they could be in a different level, essentially. And this is similar to what impact classification system it is, but basically, let's just say there's a classification of, and we in a SOPAC, we focus mostly on Class C investments only, partly because many of them are closer to the stakeholders, essentially. So that's where we focus. We want to be a de facto platform where investors or asset manager can speak the language of impact management with the enterprises altogether. But in order to do that, what we are seeing, obviously, is that there's a very different level of maturity for many of the organizations. Ultimately, we want to be here on the right quadrant, bottom-most quadrant, so that the asset manager can really help and build a portfolio where they can see continuous data and impact verification coming from. The reality still is that a lot of people are still in a phase 1 and phase 2 type of thing, which is really where they're hardly collecting governance data or activity data. They cherry pick the metrics. They even think that collecting results from enterprises is their impact, which is not the case. It's called double counting, in fact. So instead, they should really be focusing on their own additionality. How are they really contributing towards the enterprise altogether? Because ultimately, enterprises are the one who's delivering their successes towards the stakeholder, essentially. And so even enterprises can have its own classification based on the level of maturity from impact metrics, their level of data governance and culture, their impact management capacity and maturity. We have seen some of them here, but many of them are still here. And so how do we really move the needle? That's really the fundamental question. And so obviously, these are the areas that we struggle through it, which is really how do you see this, and you see much bigger horizon than we do, which is we focus on mostly in Class C, but you look at the entire spectrum of asset management. So maybe we can structure the next part of the session is how do you guide this asset manager who should be moving the needle in what are the different best practices that you think you would like to recommend to some of these asset managers? And this is again free form, and I know there are a lot of question and answers as well, so you may have seen while I was talking, but if you can at least address with that one and take on the Q&A, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, I'll try to digest and maybe also touch on some of the questions I've seen in the Q&A. So I think the first one was about ESG and impact reporting, which actually answers, or partially at least answers almost to what you have described there. So I think ultimately what is happening at the moment is that we have two areas in the field. One of those that have intentionally built strategies and portfolios that are aiming to advance sustainable development or impact. But ultimately, we obviously also have to look at the entire spectrum of capital and those kind of financial services organizations that are kind of coming to the market now, trying to do their best. And I think what would be helpful for the market as a whole, if we all kind of be pragmatic about it and be a little less judgmental. I think it will take one step after another, and that's why when I talked first to you guys, said, you know, it is a journey. It's about understanding where you are and where you want to get to. And I think the case study and some of the work we have done with our practitioners, and maybe to coming to your point, Unmesh, is like that people have an expectation for asset managers to have answers, but again, asset managers then have expectations for enterprises to have the answers. And ultimately, given that there is no clear standard, like there is, for example, with the IFRS accounting standard for financial performance, people are struggling. They don't know what to collect, what data to collect. So I think it will take some time, because ultimately, if you think about what I've described with regards to thresholds, you also need to collect historic data to be able to actually prove that you mitigated a negative outcome. So if you're asking now an enterprise to say like, oh, are you mitigating negative outcomes? They potentially can't give you that answer because they don't have the historic data. So ultimately what we've seen, what's happening between asset managers and the underlying assets in their portfolio, is that they're starting to have that conversations. And ultimately what efforts and many of the providers in the ecosystem can lend to those conversations is to give them more structure and guidance. Then I would agree with you, there's obviously a big difference in verification of impact practices and verifications of performance data. I think in the impact practice space, what we have seen is because some of these principles and guidance have been around a little bit longer, and they are probably also a little bit easier to verify and validate, because it's practices and procedures. they are a little bit more mature, and therefore I think there's a little bit more trust in some of these. Whereas with the metrics and disclosure sets, because they're so fragmented and unstandardized, and there's really not the one kind of provider or leading organization that says, yeah, you should be doing this, and this is kind of the metric sets and the key performance indicators you should be collecting. There's a little less kind of trust. And I think thirdly, and what we really should think about and talk about is like, who's picking up the costs for all of this? Because collecting data is incredibly resource heavy. It is incredibly costly. And I think a lot of the asset owners are looking to the asset managers to pick up that tab and say like, okay, yes, we actually collect the data. And then they're looking to the enterprises and say like, we need this data from you. But they're saying, well, if you want that data, you know, ultimately we need one headcount who's solely responsible for collecting data. So I think until there is a broader understanding in the market that auditing this information is obviously as rigorous and time intensive and costly as a financial performance audit, we are still a little bit in that circle mode where everybody is looking to everybody else to do the first step. What we've seen in the work that we've been doing, that obviously some fierce leader have come forward and have said like, isn't there a way that we can actually provide some of this data more transparently into the market? And I think especially with the work of Claudia Coppenolle, who had like large names like M&G Investments, for example, in there, but we're also working in the States, for example, with the Nuveen. I saw there are some people from the African continent on the call today. We're also working, for example, with Sunloan Investment, and Safgar is one of our strategic partners. So I think the more people that actually apply a common language to their impact reporting, and then ultimately also openly and transparently put that information in the market, the more it will foster the right conversations between enterprises, asset managers, and asset owners to say like, if you are thinking a company like an Apple or a company like a Tesla actually falls into that A category and mitigates negative outcomes, show me the data that proves that. So I think that's where we need to come to, that data moves out of silos, becomes more comparable, and there is actually almost a self-regulation among the investment practitioners that can help to have that conversation.
I think there's a little bit of holdup in a market. The way I see is that oftentimes the traditional people coming from financial Wall Street mindset, they think impact management is a necessary evil. But what they often forget to understand is that the sole reason why they are in the space is because of impact altogether. And by not managing impact or not managing impact risk, actually they are creating a massive amount of failure, essentially, or risk, because they can be in a reputation risk altogether. So I hope that there will be a time where they understand that there's no longer this could be a luxury altogether. At some point, this is part and parcel altogether, and I'm hoping to see that trend accelerate faster. Anyway,
yeah, I would definitely agree with that. So I think while I wouldn't go as far as that they consider it the evil, I think they struggle to understand what it is that they are actually having to do in this space by now. So they clearly see the opportunity. I think most of them were very much smart enough to understand that there is risk affiliated with that. But ultimately, I think the term, and coming back to one of the questions in the Q&A, is like, is it ESG or impact reporting? I mean, ultimately, what we're looking at, it is just smart reporting, and it's just smart investing. Because if somebody gives you 50% of the information to base a decision on, and I'm telling you, okay, this is 50% of the information, but I can give you another 50% of information that looks at entirely different kind of factors and indicators, which equally can have an impact on the performance of your investment as a whole, nobody would turn around and say like, oh, please don't give me that information. And I think that is kind of the mindset change and the cultural change that has to happen. It is just smart investing. So by looking at all the various different credentials and various indicators an investment long-term can have to align with your value and your impact intentions, as well as your financial intentions, that is just something that everybody should consider. I think the terminology and how we describe and talk about this field hasn't necessarily helped. And ultimately, I don't think it will become another asset class. I think it will just get emerged, and hopefully at one point, people will look at ESG or impact performance as they would do when they make an assessment about the financial performance of an investment.
Great. There are still a lot of questions on the open chat. Maybe you want to address some of them.
Yeah, do you want to pick one? I mean, I can go through. I think I talked a little bit about ESG and impact reporting. It really depends on who you're talking to, and I think SFDR is addressing some of these issues, that they are introducing clear labels in Europe, at least. Hopefully other areas on the continent will follow, but ultimately what they're saying, if you are not having impact, or if you're not a sustainable investment aligning with certain principal adverse impact indicators, you're not allowed to label your product as sustainable, but you can call it ESG if you're mitigating negative outcomes. If you do neither nor, don't label it that way. So there's a question on if act to avoid harm is similar to do no harm principles. It isn't, because it is not only looking at practices, it's also looking at performance. But ultimately, the acting to avoid harm or do no harm is so I think you need to have actually proof that you mitigated negative outcomes, because whereas do no harm is often a goal which is not evidenced in a certain way. Sorry, I'll have to scroll and read while I talk. And there's some very long questions, which I'm happy to answer offline. So if anyone wants to send me an email, after email address is claudia@impactalliance.co.uk. I'm happy to answer any questions offline. And I'm obviously also welcoming all of you to check out our system, which is freely accessible to anyone. Sorry, I'm just looking at the questions here. Is there one?
I can ask the question. So can self-assessment be 360 degrees encompassed? I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but
no, me neither. As to what that inclines, again, if somebody wants to clarify, I know it's a bit tricky when you're not online, but again, I'm happy to take that later. So there's a question on, can an investment banker, something popped up here. Can an investment banker or private equity fund use this tool for privately held companies, and how much would it cost per company? So ultimately, and I think that's an important point, so the tool itself can be used by anyone, but it is a self-assessment. So ultimately, at the moment, the people using it are asset managers, so the people who are actually very close to the underlying assets in a fund. And they are working either with the underlying assets or with the data they have readily available to fill out the assessment. So the system is free, but there are resources that are required from the asset managers. And that can be obviously also banks or wealth advisors in banks to make the assessment. And ultimately, and where some of this conversation is coming into play, what we have seen that while this process is helpful to show where there are gaps, to foster the communication between the underlying holdings and the fund managers, to actually create processes and policies and statements and kind of an engagement process between the various different players, it is still a self-assessment. And our work has come into play there, and some of the advisory work we do was that we would actually go back to some of them and say, like, we feel that your classification is not 100% in line with what we've seen other asset managers doing, and you might reconsider some of that. The beauty of this self-regulation, or where we feel like the role of asset owners and investors in this space and where they would come in, is that they actually request that third-party audit of classification. And there are obviously players in the field, SOPEC probably being one of them, but there are others like Tightline or Bluemark, or like Impact Finance, or like Proof of Impact. So there are certain data providers and players in the field that can obviously help to validate some of the underlying data and some of the underlying classifications in this space.
Here's a good question from Jay, and I'm going to add mine in with together. So do you see the improvement in coordination between financial performance management teams and outcome management teams? And funders view the management, the cost overhead. I think this is kind of somewhat you addressed already. But I think thrust is, how do you see this in an industry looking at the cost from impact management perspective? I know that there are a lot of blended investments are coming through. Are they leveraging those philanthropy funds to substitute? Because like there's always overhead feeling of the impact management part of it. What are the trends do you see in helping in the impact management field grow and doing the right way essentially?
Yeah, well, I see there's a lot of shift from kind of, especially if you look at asset owners or even the ultra high net worth space, from moving away from pure philanthropic capitals or pure philanthropic capital allocation to impact investing. So there's a high increase in blended finance. With this, there's obviously a higher demand for impact measurement and management, but with it also comes an increasing amount of questions around how, from a portfolio management point of view, can this actually work? So our work with some single or multi-family offices has shown that while this is shifting, it also clearly indicates that the data field isn't ready for this demand, because there are lots of providers that are catering for public equities, and that is obviously a growing space. And I would say actually some of them are very well covered with the likes of MSCI, Bloomberg, Refinitiv, ISS, and please, if you're not listed, there are many, many more, and they're all equally good or bad wherever you are. But ultimately what we're seeing, for example, specifically with some of the more social focused enterprises or the intentional kind of funds that have cropped up that are direct investments or private equity as such, it's very, very hard to make that assessment, and there are really not many data providers or solution providers that can help with the assessment. And one of the reasons, Unmesh, exactly like you say, is that currently it is very resource intensive, and that obviously also translates into the price.
Here's a good question from Madi Loman. How does impact classification complement the UN system for tracking the advancement of sustainable development goals and targets? I'm assuming they're complementary, but please go ahead.
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, UNDP is one of our official partners and sponsors, and we are very close to the UNDP SDG Impact team. The IMP has been involved in the development of the SDG Impact standards. And ultimately, we also have worked very closely with the SDG Impact team on an integration of the SDG Impact standards into the system. So the system actually has been like an initial touch point for those asset managers wanting to familiarize themselves with the SDG Impact standards to get that assessment. And as many of you know, or some that have looked at the SDG Impact standards might have seen, a question actually with regards to management approaches is a question around, are you actually aligning with the ABC, and are you classifying the underlying assets in your holding against the ABC? So UNDP is a member of the structured network of the IMP, very closely affiliated, and obviously endorsing some of the work they have previously done with the practitioner network, including the impact classes. And maybe to add on a last note, that's not only UNDP and the SDG Impact Program, but you will also find the ABC categorization or impact classes as part of the country reports that the GSG, so the Global Steering Group for Impact Investing, is putting out. As I said, there are over 300 practitioners that have now applied the thinking and the logic of impact classes, including the likes of Schroders, M&G, and Naveen. And so it is really gaining traction. And I think what is helpful recently in these conversations is that obviously the categorization and the labeling of investments according to ABC is so really heavily aligned with some of the new regulation we are seeing coming into play.
Okay, I don't know, should we continue or not? There's still lots of questions. I guess we'll have to defer them for some of the future sessions, but maybe I can end this with the last easy question for you, which is, who determines ABC classification? For example, in what you just showed, equity investments for Adidas qualify for B, what is it based on? Is it a self-assessment or somebody verifies that?
Yeah, so the impact classification is the information that we receive obviously from the asset managers. And as I said, ultimately that is based on an assessment against the data points they have available, either from third-party data providers or have collected themselves. In the concept or in the context of an Adidas, for example, it would be an assessment of the data they probably have received from of the third-party data providers to make an assessment of some of the ratings or scores provided would allow categorization as an A. In the specific case and example I shared, there was a further validation and verification, not only through the asset manager, but also through the, in this case, almost hybrid asset owner, as Claudia Coppenolle is a fund of fund managers. So they did the calibration and then further validated if they would agree. So ultimately, what would happen if, let's say we have 15 different fund managers, they all publicly classify, half of them classify Adidas as an A, the other half classifies it as a B, that we create that conversation and kind of acknowledgement in the market that we need to actually agree if it's an A or a B, and then somebody can actually do the verification of the data. And ultimately the benefit to the market would be is that we could actually create a less expensive mean to assess an investment, because the data would be transparently shared and people could actually use some of this information to at least put investments into these categories.
With that, I would say there are still lots of questions today, but sorry, we cannot answer all of them. I try to pick the small ones, something easily answerable. So, but you know, this is the area that's growing quite heavily, and there's lots of questions you have, and we'll continue to answer that in future altogether. But I'm so thankful and glad that Claudia really joined us in driving, furthering this journey, furthering the impact management process thing. There are lots of questions that it's going to emerge, but I hope this was very useful to all of you. And so stay connected and let's converse on the LinkedIn, and we'll be answering some of the questions through that. And let's just continue and march these things towards the more sustainable society. Thank you, Claudia, for your time today. Really appreciate it from the bottom of my heart. And again, thank you all of you who have plugged in and really supported SOPAC's Impact Management series. And let's continue with these conversations every month. Thank you.
Thank you.